Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Resilient Voices. Today, we are going to inspire your life. We're going to change your life because we brought Rabbi Steinmetz here, the senior rabbi of Kehillat Jeshurun, the largest modern Orthodox shul in all of Manhattan. Not only is he just the rabbi there, but he's also a huge supporter of Israel and has used his platform and his community to bring an extreme solidarity between the American Jews and the Israeli Jews, and also uniting Jews from around the world. Rabbi, we're so excited for this conversation. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for everything you do every single day.
No, it's my pleasure to be here with David and Yair, bringing people together. We got to know each other primarily because of the situation of the last couple of months.
It's been such a silver lining through this whole process that you're able to find colleagues and fighters with you that are actually moving the needle and moving things forward. We had an event hosting Michael Rappaport. We had 550 people. There were 8 other events that night for other major shuls and organizations, and your shul was packed. It was unbelievable.
It's extraordinary. And really, speaking about the solidarity point, where the community has come closer, we've come to understand how important it is to have community. I don't think anyone would have imagined that the Israeli-American Council and an Orthodox synagogue would be working together.
Yeah.
That this is what's happened in the last 8 months. We've rediscovered what it means to be a people, to be a true community.
I actually have a very interesting story from last night. I'm just going to tell you, my son and I, my oldest son lives in Englewood. I live in Englewood, and we were going to an engagement party last night, and he's late, which he usually is. Where was he? He went to Kreskill because a client of his, who's a trainer, asked him to come and put up the mezuzahs in his house in Kreskill with the wife. The wife was Moroccan, insisting, and the husband, before like a year ago, would never have been that, but now he's insisting to put up the mezuzah. So it's coming throughout the whole community.
Right. He also said he saw me. No.
So
he said he came to the event. He goes, "Oh, I heard your brother was."
Oh, he mentioned it. Yeah, he called you before. That's right.
Right, but I mean that is, by the way, part of the theme. In other words, when Yair was interviewing Michael Rappaport, and if you have not seen that interview, you should see that interview. It was amazing. It was a beautiful interview. So one of the questions you asked was about his religion, and he told you about how he started to put on tefillin for the first time in his life after October 7th. And this is the sort of story that's happening over and over again.
He never was in Israel before.
I was amazed at that.
Everybody was blown away
that this was the first time, October 8th or 10th, whenever he went, first time he was ever there.
Right. I mean, it's speaking of silver linings. I mean, it's sometimes you have to be reminded of where your family really is. And people had forgotten about that.
I will say this. You said a word, rediscovered what it means to bring Jewish communities together, and Israel and the American community. I actually don't feel that they were ever united in history. I feel like the American Jews were separate and the Israeli Jews were completely separate. And then yes, they would collaborate, and Americans would visit Israel and the Israelis would visit here. But we always, they're Israeli. We would even call them Israeli ourselves. But now I feel like we are fully united for the first time in history. I don't think it's a rediscovery. I think it's a discovery.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I think American Jews always had a strong investment in Israel. I mean, stepping away from modern Orthodoxy, which is truly religious Zionist, whatever it means to be a Zionist in America, we can talk about that later. So modern Orthodoxy has always had that connection, but Birthright understood fundamentally that there is this intuitive connection between American Jews and Israel. I think the opposite was not obvious, meaning unless you were involved with some sort of diaspora project, the average Israeli did not understand what it means to be connected to the Jewish community of the diaspora. And I'll give you an anecdote. A couple of days ago, I was interviewing Shai Davidai, and he was talking about the process of what happened after October 7th. And he said the next day, he organized an event for Israeli students. And the way he phrased it, when I asked him, he said, "I didn't realize the Jewish students would want to be part of this too," which was to me astounding, because for American Jews, of course, we love Israel. And even Jews that are not modern Orthodox, there is this profound connection, and Israel means a lot to them. But Israelis, they sometimes, certainly secular Israelis, they don't know what's going on in America. They don't understand. Oh, yeah, the American Jews do care about us. They're crying with us when we're crying.
So when I was in the Army, they put us, the American Jews and American, a little bit Canadian Jews, with the soldiers.
You have to say you're both.
I was born in Canada.
You're actually mostly Canadian.
Dual citizens.
Yes,
to be fully.
Your country
No,
of
that's not
birth was
true.
Canada.
I got my citizenship at 13, and I'm 32, right? 32.
13?
Yeah. 3 years old, we got here. 10 years, 13.
It wasn't 10 years. It was much earlier than that.
I don't know. Whatever. Who
And they came down at his bar mitzvah. They gave him. I mean, that's
yeah,
what
it was like the lucho.
Yeah.
But so when there was
Not exactly like the lucho.
Oh, similar.
I want to just make that.
Just make sure that we're not giving that endorsement. But when I was in the Army, so I would go into the unit. And the reason they would talk about the Americans and why do we have lone soldiers that would go into the Army? And the reason was because it brought up the motivation for everybody else completely, because they realized that other people around the world that they necessarily don't even speak English. You're not the American Jews go to Beersheba if they're adventurous. They go to Haifa if they're adventurous. But Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Herzliya, that's really where they go. But they don't go to Dimona. They don't go to Sderot. That's not really where they're visiting. So all of a sudden you have Israeli Jews who are originally, let's say, Moroccan or wherever, that are meeting these Americans for the first time. They're speaking English for the first time. The only English they know in American culture they know is music and Friends. They like Friends a lot, which actually Michael Rappaport was in a bunch of Friends episodes, right. which I really liked. How are you seeing the next wave of the American and Israeli relationship moving forward, and what needs to be done to strengthen it over time?
But just before you say that, I just want to also confirm, I actually have another son who finagled his way on birthright, because you're only supposed to go as at the first time, and then he moved to Israel. It's not so affiliated, but he has that strong sense of being in Israel, and now he's living there.
Wow. No, I mean, look, how does this continue is an excellent question. And the fascinating thing is, before this was happening, there were so many articles about a possible, I wouldn't call it a divorce, but a possible pulling apart of Israeli and diaspora Jews. There was really this enormous concern. There were criticisms of Israeli governments and that American Jews didn't feel comfortable with them. The vast majority of American Jews are not Orthodox. And very often ultra-Orthodox parties in Israel were in the government and would insist on a monopoly of halacha. And so there was this whole discussion of the two great Jewish communities pulling apart. And now obviously it's changing. And the question is where do we go from here?
But that pulling apart was in Israel itself. I mean, there was protests before October 7th, right? With Bibi and his
the
revision of the Supreme. Yeah, the whole country was pulling apart.
And so certainly with diaspora Jews. And so, you're asking a great question. I mean, first of all, the thing that as a rabbi is always a bit disappointing but understandable is that as Jews, we're only our best during a crisis. We do not know how to handle success. We're successful, we're accepted, we start to assimilate. Under a crisis, oh my goodness. We come together, we start putting on tefillin, we start putting up mezuzahs, we start
the Tzitzit program in Israel.
Our roots. It's really a fascinating thing. And so the question is like, God willing, we're going to get past this crisis. Will we be able to build something that is permanent and that is strong? And that's a great question. I wish I had a perfect answer for it. I think we're going to have to be intentional about it. We're going to have to work on it. We're going to have to say to ourselves, we had a crisis, and now we have to move forward in the future and learn the positive lessons from that crisis of the things we need to do and need to constantly do and never forget to do.
Yeah, people think that, history is going to happen again. The Jews are going to split. The Jewish people, the Jewish nation is very, very different right now. Right now, the Jewish people can stand up for themselves. That's never happened before. The whole concept of never again, I actually think is true. If Israel wasn't there to defend itself, Hamas and all the people that hate us would have wiped us out completely. They've tried in 48, they've tried in 67, they tried in 73. They keep trying to do that. So their intentions are there. Because we have this Israel, because we have this army, we're actually able to defend ourselves for the first time. So are we a completely different Jewish people now than we were before?
Well, it's interesting because if you're going to come from an anti-Zionist space, you would say, well, you see, if you didn't have a state of Israel, you wouldn't have had this massacre. And that's like one of the criticisms. Maybe the state of Israel failed because if these Jews had been in America, they would be in a safer place. And this is a provocative question. I'm saying it to be provocative.
Super interesting.
But I think it's more than just simple security. I mean, obviously, Zionism, one of the great strands are what they call political Zionism, which Herzl basically looks at Europe, and he's in many ways a prophet because he sees Hitler before Hitler. And he looks at Europe and he says, the Jews are not going to survive here. We got to get out. I mean, Herzl at the end embraces the Uganda plan because he really believes the Jews have to get out of Europe. But a lot of other Zionists, and he gets voted down in the Zionist Congress because they say, no, we're going back to Israel. And so from the security standpoint, we're not just in Israel because it's safe. I mean, obviously, it's not a wise thing to depend on the kindness of strangers. In other words, those who are, there's one academic who wrote a book about becoming diaspora Jews, but those who are looking at being diaspora Jews basically means that you're going to depend on the kindness of strangers, which, at least for the last 2,000 years of Jewish history, hasn't really worked out. And even places we felt that we were comfortable, we soon found ourselves to be uncomfortable. So, going back to the question, in other words, we have the state of Israel, we can fight back. And I think that's very powerful. But I think it's more than that. We have the state of Israel because we're supposed to be in the state of Israel, because this is our country. And even if it is at times more costly, and there is no question, if you look back at the last 8 months, it is far more costly to be a Jew in Israel than to be a Jew in the diaspora. It's still absolutely worth it.
Listen, I would say even farther than that. From my point of view, from an Orthodox religious point of view, I think, this is what's built into the world. I mean, you go back to Esav and Yaakov, and there was that hate that was there. And whether Israel is there, whether Israel is not there, somewhere they're going to hate us. Somewhere that's going to happen.
You are, I would call you an Orthodox skeptic. It's very interesting. We had a panel discussion on Shavuot night, Rabbi Ben Skidel and Rachel Krauss and myself, and we spoke about this whole idea of, is anti-Semitism one of the iron rules of Jewish history? And that was like our big question. And I took the negative side. I mean, we sort of try to make it into a little bit of a debate. And, Rabbi Skidel spoke about, how, Rav Moshe Feinstein, despite his enormous appreciation for the United States, did not think that we could rely on the kindness of strangers, meaning that there will always be anti-Semitism.
Eventually, something will happen.
He would react to a fascinating, anecdote about Rav Moshe is that a person in England asked if they could sue the government to support Jewish schools, and he said you shouldn't do it because it will create anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism is always there. And he quotes this, that Esav always hates Yaakov. And I, of course, took the very other point of view. And I actually spoke about a lot of the connections that I have forged with the evangelical Christian community, which has been an incredible group of supporters of Israel, although even they are beginning to soften because the younger generation doesn't quite understand it as the older generation does. So I took the opposite view. And I don't think anti-Semitism is automatic, but what is automatic is that being a minority, and being a minority that has the history of the longest hatred in human history, we're in a very vulnerable place. And to say that we shouldn't have a state, it's not a luxury that we could imagine. I mean, even if you're looking at it purely from the safety standpoint, we're better off in the long term with the state of Israel.
100%. You've lived a lot of different lives and seeing Jews from around the world because you've served and you've been the leader in many different communities. Without my dad falling in love with saying this word, the Canada word.
Let's talk about Canada.
Let's talk about Canada.
Well,
what is the difference between a Canadian Jew and an American Jew?
So It's an excellent question.
Very subtle question.
No, but there are significant differences. And it's not so much American and Canadian, because there's great similarities between, let's say, the Canadian Jewish community and the Australian Jewish community. And there is some similarity between the Canadian Jewish community and the English Jewish community. And the similarities have to do with being, first of all, American Jews, let me start this way. American Jews spend a lot of time imagining themselves as Americans, and that's the capital. It's the capital A. I'm an American. I'm a Jew, but I'm an American. And Canadian Jews have no such illusion. In other words, we know that we're Jews. I mean, when I was in Canada, I had a good friend who was named the minister in the Quebec government, and a congregant who was named the Minister of Justice, Erwin Kotler, who was an enormous hero. And even though they both didn't, Lawrence Bergman and Erwin Kotler, and even though they both didn't ordinarily wear kippot, they wore a kippah for their swearing-in ceremony. And in my mind, as an American, I said the opposite would be true in America. That someone who always wears their kippah or regularly wears their kippah, if they were being sworn into a major office, they take their kippah off because they would want to show that I'm an American like all other Americans. And Canadian Jews don't have that illusion. So that's like one difference, in that Canadian Jews have a separate identity and are not uncomfortable with that separate identity. They don't see it as undermining their Canadianness in any way.
I would make a comment. I mean, from my point of view, the United States is all about the melting pot. You bring in immigrants from around the world, so everybody comes in together, and you form into this new identity, which is the American. So whether it's Jewish or Indian or Chinese or whatever, so you're coming together and feeling that pride of nationality. You're going to the parades. I never went to one parade in Canada. There's not that feeling of pride of nationality. We didn't fight for ourselves. We didn't fight to get free. Canada didn't have any like war of independence. Didn't happen.
Canadian, and it's very interesting. I mean, if you want to sort of like pull it apart, part of it about Canadian Jews is that Canadian Jews are a little bit different in terms of composition than American Jews, because you have a lot of Holocaust survivors that came to Canada. So that kind of changes the complexion of the community. And it's a much more traditional community. And also Canada is a more traditional place. Another major difference, New Yorkers, American Jews move around. You could be born in Toronto and live in New Jersey, or live in Toronto's not an American city, but I'm just giving you as an example. But American Jews are movers. They move from place to place. You move to Boston, my son is living in Washington. He lived in Seattle. People move from place to place. Canadian Jews live where their families live. And Canadian Jews affiliate overwhelmingly with traditional Judaism. In Montreal, it's almost always Orthodox. My previous synagogue, there were people who sadly didn't really know how to hold a Hebrew siddur in the right way, and were members of my synagogue and showed up on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I mean, that's why you have to have Hebrew English machzorim. You have to have prayer books that they can read. But in Canada, it's overwhelmingly Orthodox or conservative, and people are very traditional. And the flip side is though everyone kind of works together. Like if you're not observant, you're still part of the community. We don't really care. So yes, you're here, and you're here 3 days a year, and you can't read Hebrew, but you come to synagogue. And then this guy has smicha from Yeshiva University as a rabbinic ordination, and we all sit in the same synagogue.
So I would say the reason for that is because you don't have the numbers that you have up down here. In the United States, if so much more opportunities, so many more people. One of the things that struck me
similar to like the French community, they all just kind of are together.
Yeah,
and the Persian community, they're all together.
Up there, you have no choice. You're all together. You need a minyan, so you don't care. You're not asking the 10th person, did you keep Shabbos? When you need a 10th person for a minyan, you're grabbing him and you're getting right, a minyan.
It's also less ideological Judaism. It's not like their Judaism is not their arena for ideological disagreement. It's like, okay, I'm Orthodox, you're conservative, you're Reform. We try to work together. It is a very different type of Judaism.
But why is it in Canada? I mean, you grew up conservative. There's obviously Orthodox. There's all these different levels. Is there Reform in Canada?
Sure.
There are. It's bigger in Toronto than in Montreal.
Your uncle is in Reform.
Right. Toronto has more Reform synagogues than Montreal, and there are Reform synagogues.
Oh, so Toronto does have, like, there is some divide, but when they practice, people practice and they go into the traditional realm.
Right.
Which is, that's pretty amazing. The communities that you've been around, have you felt that the leadership and the rabbis actually make a difference in each of the communities, or it's just kind of keeping the status quo? Like, what is the goal when somebody brings a rabbi into a community? What is the goal and the purpose for them?
So this is the sort of the $64,000 question for every rabbi.
Only 64,000.
Yeah, I was like, it's kind of low. You got to think about inflation.
You're a low pay.
At least $1 million.
Is that part of the parsonage, or is that
$64,000 pyramid? It was a long time ago.
Did they give you the house with that 64 grand? Is that just for tuition?
But it really, is a rabbi supposed to be a change agent? That's a huge question. If you go back, Achad Ha'am has this wonderful essay about Kohen v'Navi, right? That he contrasts what a prophet is like and what a Kohen, what a priest is like. And an Navi is a rebel in a certain sense. In other words, he comes to people and he tells them, you got it all wrong. You have to change everything. And the Navi is a change agent, but the Navi is always an outsider. The Kohen is the guy who says, okay, here you sinned. Let me take your animal. We're going to atone for your sin. We're going to make everything good. And the Kohen is the interpersonal guy. Aharon, as the Mishnah puts it, is the ultimate Kohen, and he's the person who brings peace between everyone. The Nevi'im are not peacemakers. Yirmiyahu, they want to kill Yirmiyahu. They literally try to kill him twice. So there's this enormous difference in roles. And the question is should a rabbi be a change agent, which is question number one. But the question number two is, can a rabbi be a change agent? And really the only way a rabbi can be a change agent, I believe, is either by undergoing an enormous amount of warfare within his own synagogue and changing it to his way, or starting a new synagogue. And so most rabbis, and I would include myself in this, fall into the Kohen slot. Fall into the slot of someone who comes, who wants to help everybody with their own religious needs. And what you really hope to achieve is these sort of individual switches that this person—
the little wins.
And the little wins are big wins. Like, it's funny, I had a text back and forth with John Kushner the other day. I don't know if, whatever, about Michael Rappaport, because he's Michael Rappaport's friend. And I'll do that again. I had a text the other day with John Kushner, who is Michael Rappaport's friend, and he said, inviting him for that Friday night dinner, which he spoke about when you were interviewing Michael Rappaport, that had an enormous impact on Michael Rappaport. Like, it's the little things that end up being big things. And I can look at my career where people will say, 25 years ago, you told me to do X, Y, Z, and now my whole life has changed. I remember when I left Montreal, I had a congregant who said, I wandered into your synagogue because I didn't really know. I didn't know an Orthodox synagogue. I wandered in. You came over and said hello. You ended up inviting me over for lunch. And now, whatever, it was like 10 years later, my life has been transformed. So it's these little wins that become big wins. So you're not a change agent in the larger sense, but in the smaller sense, you make an enormous difference.
So I love that. I love that comparison. I think it's great. And we were living in Teaneck for 25 years. We went to B'nai Ashur, and I'm sure you're familiar with Rabbi Stephen Brzezinski. So he took the Navi approach, right? He saw people from talking in shul, and he was always outspoken about Israel when he was proven right afterwards. But then he was, anyway, I'm sure you know all about him and where he is now. So I think he took that Navi approach. But now they have a new rabbi, Rabbi Schreiber, I think it is, and they love him there in Teaneck because I think he's taking the Cohen approach. Because we have a good friend of ours, Abe, actually, told me that he was there when this rabbi was first introduced, and he saw, everybody's dancing with the Torah or whatever they're doing, and he sees that the rabbi's speaking with his son for like half an hour just on the side, just schmoozing with his son. And that's I love that comparison, because then now this new rabbi, and they love him there now, is the Cohen approach.
Right. I mean, rabbis also have to be very careful. The goal is not to be loved. The goal is to do what's right for your congregation, which is not always the same thing. In other words, you could go for the cheap claps, but you really have to think about what's right for your congregation. But you're absolutely correct. The Cohen approach, though, is very much focused on making sure that the person you're dealing with feels closer, feels better, feels happier.
Super interesting, because you're also talking about what you would think a rabbi coming into a new community can change things and do more and build more. But it's also, it speaks a lot to me about the Jewish people. One of them is to build, yes, to grow the community. That is the goal, but it's also to keep its survival and keep people engaged, which is incredibly, incredibly hard. How are you transitioning from an older congregation and engaging the younger congregation? Just as you said before, the Christian evangelicals are having a hard time engaging their younger people to be pro-Israel. How are you specifically bringing the older and generation to the younger generation together, not just bringing a younger rabbi that can try to engage it?
Right. So, we're a large congregation. So large congregations are very different than small congregations. Like even that question, like in my previous synagogue in Montreal, which was about a little bit less than half the size of my current one. So you don't have a young people's service. Everyone has to sort of be together. Also, it's multi-generational, so everyone is kind of intertwined with each other. And in a community like that, the real question is whether the young people are just going to wake up Shabbat morning and come to synagogue. They'll be a member of the synagogue, but they may not show up. And the question is how do you inspire them to start coming to synagogue? How do you inspire them to do more? But the community feels as one. There's no sort of like.
But that's really the $64,000 question: is how do you get the young people to be engaged and to be interested and to make them feel a part of the community so that they do want to come?
So this is a huge, huge issue, and I could take up the rest of the podcast on that. It's a challenge, and I remember I had an older member in my previous synagogue who was a Holocaust survivor who had studied in the yeshiva of the Yisrael Meir Kagan of Radin, the sainted Chafetz Chaim. And one Shabbat afternoon where the Chafetz Chaim would take questions and answer people. So a young boy who was very chutzpahdik, who had a lot of chutzpah, and knew that the Chafetz Chaim had a son who was no longer religious. And this young yeshiva boy who had chutzpah turned to the Chafetz Chaim and said, they say that an apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Rebbe, how is it possible that your son turned out this way? And the Chafetz Chaim looked at the boy and he says, you're absolutely right. An apple doesn't fall far from the tree, except when there's a hurricane. When there's a hurricane, the apple can fall anywhere. And we live in a time which is a time of hurricanes. And I've looked at the last century, and I've looked at whether it be religious identity. Now we're having a problem with young Jews on campus in terms of them staying aligned with Israel, which you would think is a no-brainer. And yet because of the incredible brainwashing going on campus, the opposite is happening. And I just say to myself, okay, we're in a hurricane. So the question is, okay, well, if you're in a hurricane, what do? You try to get to the apples as soon as possible, number one, before they get blown off the tree. And you try to do everything you can to bring people in. Chabad has an incredible model. And what we've learned from Chabad is that the interpersonal becomes the spiritual. People will understand Judaism better when they sit down at a Shabbat meal than they will by going into a synagogue. And I remember years ago reading a sermon by a Reform rabbi from England, where the Reform rabbi properly said, I learned more from my mother's chicken soup than I did in all of my years in rabbinical seminary. Because it's that bond of love, that bond of connection. And there have been sociological studies on this. The bond of connection is what helps people understand spiritual identity, right? Because how do you get to spiritual identity? Well, first of all, it's a lived identity. And when the lived identity gives you a sense of purpose and meaning, then you understand, oh, now I understand spirituality. And also you get spirituality better when you're interfacing with another person. You like that little spark of Tselem Elokim, of being in the image of God, sort of like comes off. And so that's if you want to have any success nowadays in bringing in young Jews, it has to be with love. It has to be, now, of course, you want to be interesting and you want to be avant-garde and you want to use social media and you want to, all of those things are marketing. But I think at the core, if we're going to show them spirituality, it has to be wrapped in love. It can't just be pure spirituality.
And if a person's not sincere, they know it in 2 seconds. Like if it's 2 seconds, they know.
There have been insincere people who've made it past the,
so they know how to be an actor. They know how to act. But if a person is not trying to be fake and if he's not sincere, it comes across right away.
The Gemara says Nikarim divrei emet, that the words that are true are obvious.
How has October 7th changed you?
That's an emotional question. The morning of October 7th, speaking about having a diverse community, one of my members who lives in the building at 8 o'clock on a Shabbat morning knocked on my door, which is highly unusual. And I go to the door and he says to me, "Rabbi, there's been an attack in Israel." And I said, "Okay, there are attacks in Israel." He said, No, it's a big attack. I said, okay. It's a bigger attack than usual. He said, no, this is nothing like you've ever seen. And I realized that this is serious. And so I went down and I got the doorman and I had him turn on the TV to CNN. And for 2 days of Yom Tov, and I did it because I remembered during the 1973 war, the Yom Kippur War, that this is what the Jews in Muncie did. They kept their radios on because they could not abide going through Sukkot or Shabbat without knowing what's going on in Israel. And I had the TV on for 2 days, and every minute that I wasn't in shul, I was watching CNN. I'm sure, like many others, it didn't take a lot of imagination to think that this could topple the state of Israel. You just had to say to yourself, well, what if Hezbollah goes full force? What if Iran goes full force? What if Syria goes full force? And they do it all at the same time. What if the West Bank breaks out? We don't have enough soldiers. We don't have a way of dealing with all of that. And for those first 2-3 days, it was frightening. I couldn't sleep. I'm sure. I'm not telling you anything.
I had the exact same situation. Somebody came to shul at Daven Hashkama. It's 8 o'clock in the morning. A friend of mine came by and he says there was an attack. Oh, okay, it's an attack. Okay, a regular attack. No, he says it's a bigger attack. Exactly like what you said. Okay, it's a bigger attack. Maybe they'll have to call up the reserves. No, it's something serious. And I'm thinking to myself during Shabbat morning, are we the generation that's going to lose Israel?
Yeah. So what I told people, and actually we had a very large fundraiser for AIPAC at someone's home, and I told people, I said, what went through my mind is I don't know how I can be a rabbi anymore if the state of Israel disappears. I know that people had to be rabbis after the Holocaust. Part of it was that American Jews, frankly, turned their minds off to the Holocaust, so maybe it wasn't as difficult. And part of it was that the state of Israel arrived 3 years later. But I was saying to myself, do I continue? Do I quit? Do I find something else to do? Because I don't know if I could go on as a rabbi. I don't know how well I could go on as a person, but certainly as a rabbi, if the state of Israel disappears. And that was overwhelming. And so, I thought about generations before. My own mother was a survivor of Auschwitz, a Holocaust survivor. I had in my previous synagogue, like I said, Montreal was a very heavily survivor city, and I had Holocaust survivors that I knew, speaking about what the state of Israel meant to them. I remember my friend Johnny, who lost everyone except for his mother. He lost his father, his 2 sisters, his brother, and he would say to me that the state of Israel, he would say it in Yiddish, is unser nechama, is our comfort. And I was thinking about that, and I was thinking, okay, well, what if we lose it? And I was thinking about how my mother dealt with so many difficulties in her life, and she just said, we're going to keep going. And I think that's where it sort of got me. It's okay, we're going to keep going. And we're going to do this as a community. And actually, I got a lot of inspiration because, look, Rabbi Lookstein and his father, that's the way they did it. There's a crisis. We're going to go forward and do whatever we have to do. And that's what we started October 8th. October 7th, I got up in shul and I said, we're raising money for the UJA campaign. Did I know there was a UJA campaign? No, but I knew that there was a UJA campaign. And I said, we're going to raise as much as we can. And over the weeks, we raised millions of dollars for that emergency campaign. And then we did other campaigns. I mentioned APAC. There's other campaigns that we ended up doing.
The mobilization in New Jersey and Englewood was unbelievable. Yeah. And the hundreds of duffels going over. People were sending off over the wrong equipment.
What about the American soldiers that flew to Israel to serve, that weren't even...
They get on a plane and go over there.
Ex-Chayalim Bodedim. I still have friends that are Americans, lived in Brooklyn, went to the army with me, and they're still in the army now.
Yeah.
Went back.
I met a guy, a soldier, who was on vacation, I think in Uzbekistan. I forget where it was. No, it was...
I think I heard it Ecuador or something. There was something in Ecuador.
And his son was murdered. And he gets off the plane, and they weren't ready for the funeral. He reported straight for duty. And that's where we have to be. So after October 7th, I had a taste of the type of things that the previous generation had to go through. And I realized that the only way we do it is we do it together. The only way we do it is if we're all in.
And you've been all in, which is why I've been, and we've been,
as a people, we've been all in.
Not as a, yes, as a people, we've been all in. We've been all in.
Around the world, people have been all in.
It's really, it like, you speak about silver linings. It's really, that's what gives me comfort. What gives me comfort is watching how the Jewish people have such enormous strength. Like I said, the problem is that we're best in a crisis, but we are best in a crisis.
So I want to, you're the rabbi, but just a little Torah that I've always thought about since October 7th is that, wine is one of our most important food items. We use it for our kiddush. We use it for everything because when the grapes are squeezed, that's when the fruit comes out. That's when the juice comes out. Same thing. That's why it's so important to us as Jewish people. When we're squeezed, that's when the best part comes out.
Yep. I would rather not be that way, but okay. I mean, there's the other analogy is that that's why you have a beitza. That's why you have an egg at the Passover Seder, is because eggs are the one thing that become harder when they get boiled up, meaning that you don't soften it by cooking it. It only makes it tougher. And the Jewish people get tougher.
Or you can talk about the sabra fruit. I mean, the sabra fruit that's in there. It's prickly and tough on the outside.
Oh boy, and we're doing this.
And on the inside, it's all sweet.
I'm getting hungry. I'm starting to get hungry here.
You guys are story topping. So you've been so resilient over this time. And there's been a defining moment in your life that allowed you to become so resilient. What is that? What was that defining moment in your life?
Right. So I wouldn't say it's a defining moment as much as it was a defining influence. I already mentioned my late mother, who was a Holocaust survivor. So after the war, and my mother survived with two sisters. She was in what is now Romania, but was part of Hungary. And so the Hungarian Jews were deported, as my mother likes to say, around Pesach in 1944. So it was towards the end of the war. So the Hungarian Jews were, although Hitler managed to wipe out over 80% of the Hungarian Jews, but they came in later. So those who survived had a better chance of survival. And my mother was able to survive with both of her sisters. And my mother came here to America, married my father, came to Muncie. And when my mother was 8 months pregnant, my father had a car accident and died. Oh. And I have three older siblings. I'm the fourth. And my mother sat Shiva. I was born on the Shloshim. And my mother was incredibly positive. My mother was incredibly strong. We used to tell stories about how nothing got in her way. I mean, she was the sweetest human being possible. But strong underneath. Like nothing was going to hold her back. Like if she needed to do something, she did it. But like everyone said, oh, your mom is so nice. She's so sweet. But she was strong. And I remember when my mother passed away, an elderly rabbi came and said, I have to speak at the funeral. So, okay, you need to speak. He got up and said, I remember when she was sitting Shiva for her husband, and she looked at everyone in the Shiva and said, don't worry, I will take care of this family myself. And that sort of resilience is something I always think in my own mind. I remember when my daughter went to Poland, and so the technique they have is they ask the parents to write a letter that they open up in Auschwitz. At least that's what they did when my daughter was here. And I wrote her about my mother. And I said, I just want you to know that what my mother had is part of you, and you have that inner strength as well.
It's amazing.
That's beautiful.
It's so deep. How does a rabbi address the financial needs, concerns of a community? How do you look at money? How does religion and money come together?
So that's a great question. It's a large question. I think money is not all that different than anything else in the physical realm, which means you need to have it to be comfortable. In other words, you should not in any way negate it. You need to have it because in order to achieve everything else you need to achieve in your life, you need to have that to do it. On the other side, you need to not obsess about it, right? You know, it's no different than food or sex or anything else that's part of the physical world. It needs to, so to speak, you need to follow the middle path with it. It's important holistically for a human being. In other words, someone should never be, I mean, the Gemara makes this clear. They don't want Torah scholars to look like beggars, which unfortunately does happen. In other words, it's demeaning. You want to be able to have that independence. But what money has to be, money, you have to follow the middle path, which is something the Rambam, of course, brings into Judaism, which is this idea that you don't go to either extreme, and you need to find a way to make it work. Now, on the flip side, right, you can go to both extremes. You could be someone who doesn't care about money, and your children don't have shoes, and life, you do not accomplish the things you need to accomplish in life, and your life doesn't look good, doesn't feel good. And then on the other side, you could not be able to let go of money and either not spend it, or it's obsessed that you have to constantly work for it. And like all of those sort of like charts where they chart happiness and financial success. So it tops out at one point, right? In other words, when you hit a certain level, beyond that, you don't need money. Money is not going to make you any happier.
It means something quite different. When you get to a certain level, money doesn't mean the same as it means.
So it's very interesting because that's your community has that level, right. and they also have the below. It's a very, that's something that
right. I mean, it's the Upper East Side, and just by the real estate values dictate that only a certain
you're more on the wealthier, on the wealth side, not on the
just
poor.
In case people
not on the poor side. That's not your issue. Is the poor side? You're more dealing with the ones that are obsessing.
We are certainly representative of the 1%. There's no question about that.
Yes.
And you're right. And the challenges there, frankly, are a whole other set of challenges. In other words, you have to bring yourself back to the middle path. In other words, there can be enormous battles over monies and inheritances, which happen, unfortunately, all too often. I remember in Montreal, one of the funeral directors telling me that literally in a limousine back from the graveside, they started to yell at each other about the will. In other words, they're just buried.
We have plenty of experience. We have plenty of experience.
You have more experience.
We've played a lot of life insurance claims. It's
and if they're fighting, and it's finding that middle path of learning, reminding yourself that money is an instrument, right? Money is not
People forget
the goal. It is it's an instrument for you to do what God put you on this earth to do. So it's an instrument for you to help support your family. It's an instrument for you to see God's beautiful world. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch used to say God will ask you when you get up to heaven, how come you didn't go to see my Alps? In other words, yes, money is meant to enable you to do things that you should be doing, to enjoy life in the way you should enjoy life. But it should never, ever become an idol. It should never become something that you worship.
Rabbi, thank you for being here today. How can people find you? How can people get connected with you? How can people follow you?
Congregation Keilath Jeshurun website. You can find my email if that's what you're interested in. I am on Instagram. I am on Facebook. I am on Twitter. I am not on TikTok. What?
You're not on LinkedIn. You are on LinkedIn. Sorry, you are on LinkedIn.
You're on LinkedIn.
Absolutely.
The
Jewish dating, the Jewish dating site. The Jewish dating site.
It's LinkedIn now. The Jewish dating.
That's what Mikey said at the event. That was part of his routine.
No, because I met my wife on the Jewish dating app,
really?
LinkedIn. Yeah, it was very funny.
Oh, right. But like it's interesting. It's like my wife, she constantly gets job offers on LinkedIn. Rabbis doesn't happen to rabbis. Just so you know.
We could talk about that.
So thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being such a partner in this, another partner of ours that is fighting for the Jewish people and fighting for the Jewish homeland and fighting for freedom and fighting for humanity. And I see it every single day. And it's been amazing to call you a friend and to call you a mentor and to see what you're doing. It's just blowing people away. And I hope
if I can plug Yair and David, I just met, but Yair is unbelievable. And what you did with Michael Rappaport is above and beyond. And that's why we met each other, because you're all in. You're all in. And that's something that's so inspiring to me.
Yeah, it's been amazing. It's been an amazing journey. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and we'll see you on the next one.